Hi, welcome to Sacred Intelligence TV. As always, we are so delighted that you join us, and we hope that you had a wonderful holiday season and you're ready for 2015 and all that it brings to you. Today we are joined, or I am joined by Susan Bainbridge and Donald Bliss. Thank you so much for being with us again, Don, and Susan, as always, thank you for joining me as well. Today we are going to talk about relationships and how we get to healthy relationships. But I'd like to begin by telling you a story, and some of you might be familiar with it. And it's the story of a baby lion who was born to this noble family of lions. And one day he got separated from his family. So he wandered through the meadows looking for his family and wandered through the jungle looking for them very frantically, but then he came upon some sheep that were grazing in the meadows. And he said, well, this must be my family, because after all, he's a baby. He doesn't know. So he goes over and he joins the sheep. When he gets there, he's looking at them and he's noticing that they're eating grass. So he decides to eat grass just as they were eating grass. But he noticed that he really didn't like the taste of the grass, but he did it anyway. He noticed that his neck was also hurting because he just couldn't do what the other sheep did. But he figured, I'm here, I'm going to fit in with them. This must be my family. He even began to make that little bad noise that sheep make. So pretty soon, he also noticed, wait a minute, my hair isn't coming in just like the other sheep. Why am I different? Despite his differences, though, he decided that he would fit in and change who he was. Well, one day they heard the sound of a lion roaring nearby. All the other sheep, they got really frightened and afraid, and they decided that they would huddle together. But something spoke to the lion's inner being, and rather than being afraid, he went over to the lion. The lion said to him, "What are you doing here with the sheep?" He said, "I'm a sheep." The lion said, "No, you're not a sheep." He said, "Yes, I am." The lion takes him over and he allows him to look into the river where he could see what he looked like. He said, "Do you look like the other sheep?" "No, I don't. I look like you." And he said, "That's because you're a lion." So today what we want to talk about is those circumstances in which we try to fit in which we try to be something that we're not, or when we truly just forget who we were created to be. Because we were created to be divine spiritual beings who were made out of goodness, love, and light. And sometimes when we engage in relationships, whether they be romantic or relationship with coworkers or other family members, we lose our way. We forget that we were created out of goodness. So today we're going to talk about how do we begin to develop those selfish relationships. And by selfish, of course, you know by now if you've seen the show, it means taking care of yourself. It means examining yourself. It means improving who you are so that you can live to your fullest potential and that you'll be able to have a greater capacity to love and share in your shared relationships. But I do want to start by just mentioning a couple of things about our selfish relationships before we go into some techniques with you. And that is this: how we feel about ourselves will impact the way we treat ourselves. The second thing I want to say is how we feel about ourselves impacts the way we treat others, and it impacts the way we allow others to treat us. So it is very important, particularly as we're starting this new year, to think about what are those things we need to change about ourselves in order to have healthier relationships with other folks. And sometimes that change means changing some of the people in our lives as well. We start out, though, in our selfish relationships by having a deep, abiding sense of who we are and who we are created to be. And the only way we can do that is to tap into that sacred relationship. You heard us say before on our other shows that the way we tap into that sacred relationship, whatever that is for you, is to spend time with the sacred, to spend time with the universe, the source, whatever it is you choose to call it. I call it God. So the way I know who I am and who I was created to be is to spend time with God. And if I spend time with God, when I show up in a relationship that is not healthy for me, that's harmful or destructive for me, then I can decide based on my knowledge of who I am, what I will choose to experience and not experience in that relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that some things don't happen that I don't want to happen. It just means I can decide how I will respond and react to those things. But the spending time is crucial. You cannot wait until you're in an overwhelming, harmful, destructive relationship to begin all of a sudden practicing techniques that you haven't practiced for, that you haven't built up in your core, and expect that change will happen immediately. It takes time. So if you're the type of person who prays, you can't pray in a second and expect that you're going to have all the resources that you need in that 1 second if you have not prepared yourself in the long run. Because what prayer does, yes, the sacred is powerful and the sacred could change your situation immediately, but most of us, we have to go through some things and endure our relationships or challenges, whatever those challenges may be. So what the prayer does is that it changes you, changes your behavior, and it also lets you know what are some of the things that I should be praying for in this relationship. If it's scripture that you use, scripture is something that you'll be able to call on and to use and to help strengthen you during those times where you might feel weak or where your faith may be faltering. So the idea is that you spend time practicing those things that you believe in that call you to be connected with the sacred. So today we're going to also offer to you that while it is important that you have that relationship with the sacred often guides you to a place of where you need to get professional help, where you need to go to talk to other folks for counseling, or it could be your spiritual advisors, it could be your friends, but we like to also say that folks should come to see therapists because therapists can be objective with you. So today we're going to offer you some tools that might be valuable in terms of helping you to gain more insight into your behaviors and your actions and the way that you communicate perhaps that will help you to have healthier relationships. So I want to invite Don and Susan in on the conversation, and we're going to focus today mainly on 4 areas, but these are not the only areas for you to focus on. In fact, some of these areas will overlap. But today we're primarily going to focus on our thoughts. We're going to focus on our behavior, our communication, and our emotions. So I want to begin today going back to our thoughts, because we know that our thoughts also influence our behavior as well. So when we began with looking at our thoughts, there 3 sort of things I'd like us to begin our conversation with, Don and Susan, about our thoughts. And a lot of this, of course, is based on our experience that we've had with clients that we have, but also our personal experiences, because we're all in relationships. So when we think about thoughts, there are 3 sort of things I'd like us to spend a little bit of time talking about. And one is taking responsibility for your thoughts. The second is everything that you think is a problem isn't always a problem. And then the third is reframe your thinking. So can we just start a little bit today in terms of just looking at how do we begin to help people to take responsibility for their own thoughts, and what do we really mean when we're saying take responsibility for the way that you think?
I was thinking in terms of that specific point, that I remember distinctly the time that I actually came to realize how much power we have over our thoughts. I think a lot of us go around saying things like, well, it's just how I feel, I can't help it. Or, something to that effect. But to realize that your thoughts affect your emotions and that you can direct your thoughts, that you have power over where you guide your attention, where you're spending your time focusing any kind of thinking, whether it's going off into the future and worrying about things to come, or whether it's getting caught up in the past and things we regret or that sort of thing, that knowing that we have power over our own thoughts is empowering, I think. I remember just feeling very excited by that thought when it first occurred to me that this was something that we absolutely do have control over our thoughts.
And really being conscious of our thoughts too, right? Because there are things that we think unconsciously that we respond in that way because we don't even know unconsciously, I've thought that perhaps you've offended me in some way. So then I'm reacting to that. So do you have anything to add to that in terms of thinking about that, Don?
Well, I was just thinking about how, as you said, Susan, it's really the only thing we have power over ultimately is our thoughts. And so much flows from our thoughts. Feelings often flow from our thoughts very directly, sometimes very indirectly, but often very directly. And if we change the way we think about something, change our perspective, it can very dramatically affect our feelings and the way that we think about so many things. But ultimately, the only thing that we have control over is our mind, our thoughts. And I was just thinking also too about glass half empty, glass half full, which is a very good example with which everyone probably is familiar. And it's simply a matter of perspective, how we see that.
Well, and I think that sort of brings us to the point when we're talking about examining ourselves and our own relationship with ourselves. Our thoughts are so important in terms of how we see ourselves. So if we are going to take responsibility for our own thoughts, we need to know if we're the type of person who typically thinks negatively.
Yes.
And some people don't realize that there's always a negative slant on life. This is just the way life is. Or like you said before, this is just how I feel. Well, if you're taking ownership of your thoughts, and then you know, like you're saying, Susan, you have the power to change your thoughts, that's a part of your own self-reflection and for you growing to be a healthier person. And ultimately, if you are a healthier person, then you have better shared relationships.
Healthier relationships, absolutely.
But I think that there's another critical piece if we think about the sacred as well. Some people have sacred practices and will take religion, organized religion, for an example, where their religion tells them what to think. Now you're all reading out of the same, and I'll say the Bible, because I can only speak from my perspective and perspective of people that I've worked with. So we're all reading from the same sacred text. And yes, there should be some consistency with it. But if you know that people are doing things that's counter to what you interpret that text to be, based on your relationship with God and based on your relationship, because I do think it's important for you to be in the context of your faith and to be in communion with folks. But if people are outright doing something that's counter to that, that's hurtful to you and your spirit, then you have to know, you have to take ownership for how you're thinking in that way, because if you're just being led strictly by someone else and not saying, well, wait a minute, I have thoughts that are important in this situation too. So I think there are different ways that we can look at taking responsibility for your thoughts. What are my thoughts in this? So if we're in a relationship with someone, and we deal with this all the time in romantic relationships, for instance, particularly when we get into male-female relationships, we often want to see, particularly as women, well, what's he thinking about this? Or will he ask me to marry him? Or maybe I should stay in this relationship with him because, you know, he's thinking this way, but I'm thinking this way. If you're not comfortable in that, take ownership for what your thoughts are, and then you can act based on this. But if you're thinking, well, I'm not going to get another man, I better take this person, then sometimes it leads to some dire consequences. So the taking ownership for thoughts, I think, is also about respecting what your thoughts are and believing what your thoughts are. you know.
I was remembering how often people say, I don't know, when we ask them, you know, well, what do you think about that? Or what do you want to do? Or, well, I don't know. And I don't buy it. I mean, I think sometimes they have not gone through the process of sorting out their thoughts and getting to what they think about something. Often they don't want to say because they're afraid of offending us, or there's some other dynamic involved in that. But I don't buy that people don't know. I think ultimately we do know what we're thinking if we take the time to get to that place. And another thought that I had was about meditation. And you were talking about prayer and just being in touch with the sacred. And meditation is a way to clear the mind, and one might even say clean the mind. And to the more that we calm our thoughts, the more we're able to be in touch with the sacred, that still small voice within, as I sometimes say and have said in past shows. So I think it's really important for us to take the time and to slow down a little bit and be in touch with our thoughts and find out what we really think.
Well, I think that that's critical, and that it leads into the next point about everything that you think is a problem isn't a problem. If you spend time in meditation, maybe it would bring some clarity around some of the things that you think might be an issue, right?
I think also when you were speaking about folks who have a tendency to think in negative ways or fall into the pattern of negative thinking, that I think one of the things, I mean, we're trying to give some practical tips on, you know, okay, so we could say take responsibility for your own thoughts. What does that mean? How do we start that? And one of the easiest ways that I often share with people that I work with is just to start becoming very aware of the language that you use. Because somebody could think that they're not having negative thoughts, but if they are using emotionally charged language, whether it's in communication with others or whether it's just in that, you know, that narrator in their head, where they're using this, there are usually 3 words I warn people to be very aware of, and those are should, need, and can't. And so I think just the language. I mean, I think people don't tend to pay too much attention to how negative the language they use can be.
I think they're all interwoven, right? Because if you're using the negative language, even if you're not conscious that you're having a thought about something, you know, the language then really impacts the thought, but then the thought impacts the type of language you use. One of the things I thought about when you were saying that is how we think about money sometimes, right? And
which is also a relationship.
Which is a relationship, exactly,
Yeah.
right? So if we think about money, for instance, I know that I am guilty of sometimes if my kids, because they want. And often, depending on what the budget is at that moment, I will say something like, I don't have any money for that. Well, in fact, that's actually not true. I don't say for that, I say I don't have any money, which is different from saying it is not in the budget, or that's not how I choose to spend my money.
That's not my priority.
Exactly. So if I'm saying I don't have any money, that's a thought that's there. And then we begin to behave in ways that suggest that we don't have any money, and so then we don't live out of our abundance. So we have to really be careful with the thinking and the language and the behaving. And as you can see from our discussion, that really all of these things are interrelated, because our thoughts impact our behavior for sure, and they impact the language that we use. But what we often say, particularly as a behaviorist, is that we have to reframe our thinking, reshape our thinking, and that's one of the tools that we give to people. So again, as the example that I just used, instead of saying I don't have any money, you can say I choose to spend my money differently, because that is the truth of the matter. Or if we're just in a situation, in a relationship where we assume someone is treating us in a particular way, We take it personally how they're treating us, right? We assume that they're being angry in that moment because of something that we did. And so we automatically go into the negative thinking around that, when in fact we can reframe our thinking just to say, well, wait a minute, maybe they're just having a bad day. And if they're just having a bad day, or we reframe it in that way, we're going to respond differently, which changes our interaction with that person.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Susan, just give us one other technique that you often talk about with just our thinking, or even the different patterns of thinking. Maybe you can just share a couple of
certainly
those.
what you just described is what I would call personalization, right? You make other people's actions or the things going on around you about you. You walk into your home and your partner is slamming cupboards and stomping around, and you immediately assume that they're angry with you. And that's a very human tendency. We tend to be very sort of self-centered, and I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way, but that's what we tend to do, right? So I think that's certainly one. Overgeneralizing is another. I mean, I think anytime that we start using absolutes, and again, this is a language thing, but avoiding words like always or never or all or none or everybody or nobody, like everybody hates me, nobody likes me. Well, clearly that's not true, and not only is it not true, it's not helpful to think that way. There are lots of other ones. Shoulds, having these kind of ironclad rules that we have, the way we think things should be, or the way we think people should act.
Language is so important.
It really
the
is.
way we language things and speak to things, and it's a reflection of our thoughts, as you said. And when we become more aware of our language, we can also become more aware of our thoughts.
Absolutely.
But
I'm sorry
think-
for interrupting
No,
you, but
no, not at all.
But I think of something else that's interesting when we're kind of talking about this whole issue of reframing in language. I am a person that I just really do not like cursing. And that's not because I'm just this prim and proper person. It's just, it's often offensive to me. Sometimes people can say it and it doesn't offend me. And of course, if you're in therapy and you're cursing, I don't just stop you and go, please, please, please don't curse. I know that there's a time and place that people use language, different language to express themselves. And I get that. But there are times when I am in relationship with folks and they're using that language, and I take it personally. I take it as a personal offense because I grew up in a household where I didn't hear my father using that language. I didn't hear my mother using that language. I mean, I just didn't grow. Even the people in my community, I didn't grow up hearing them curse. I knew about curse words, but it just wasn't something that happened. But I noticed that there's a difference. If I take it personally, let's say you and I are talking and you're cursing, and I take it personally, then my reaction to you is different than it would be if I just said to myself, well, that's Susan's way of expressing herself. It's not a personal affront. It's not disrespectful.
It's not about you at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes, particularly if it's people that I'm in close relationship with, I might think, well, why can't you just change that for me if I'm telling you that that's something that's offensive? But on the other hand, that's who they are. That's their being. And so sometimes I have to adjust my thinking, or I have to decide when enough is enough and make different choices. So that is crucial for us. Our thought patterns are very crucial. But I think in line with that, since we're talking about various ways of communicating, let's take a look for a second at when we're looking at ourselves, what are some different things that we can do and how we communicate and how we interact in our relationships to help us to have healthier relationships. So I want to just point out 4 things that I'd like us to address in this particular time period. When we're looking at communications, communicating with others, one thing that we have to think about is that other people cannot guess what we need or what we want in a particular circumstance. We have to be clear We have to be able to express our needs. It goes back to what Don was saying when we say, what do you want? And people say, I don't know. Think about what it is that you know. And then everything that we think or we feel does not have to be shared with others. You know, people who feel like they have to blurt out everything, and we'll discuss all of these a little bit more. You don't have to share everything you're thinking or feeling. And then, as we've already mentioned, avoid words like always or you never. And that is something that I have to work on a lot, because, you know, it's so easy for us to say, well, you always do such and such. No one ever always does anything, right?
Human beings are not that consistent.
Exactly, exactly. And then the fourth thing that I want us to spend a little bit of time talking about is mean what you say and say what you mean. Don't test other people by being childish, because we do that in relationships sometimes. So if we could go back to the first one in terms of just being specific with our request and other people not having to guess at what we want and what we need. I think all of us have, as therapists, have heard people say, well, they should just know what I need.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely. Yep.
They should have known. They, you know, how could they not have known? And there are all different kinds of ways to read what people say and what people do, and we don't know. We really need for people to tell us and to ask too. I mean, we can ask, well, we come home and somebody's slamming cupboards, instead of immediately personalizing that and making it about us. What's going on with you? You know, is there something going on? Oh yeah, something happened at work today. You know, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with us.
Exactly. And it's interesting to think about, well, we're talking about how others can't know what we need and want unless we tell them. And the same goes in the other direction, of course, is and that's another, I think, thought process issue with some of us, is that we begin to mind read. We begin to think that, and it often happens in close relationships, family, romantic relationships, where we think we've known someone long enough that we know what they're thinking or what their motivations are for doing a particular thing. But we don't. And if we act upon our assumptions about what they're thinking or what their motivations are, often we're wrong, and that can cause more problems.
So here's what's interesting about this. Sometimes we can know and we can be right about it, but it's okay to ask for verification.
Yeah,
that's one
absolutely.
thing. But the second thing is, I think that sometimes we are close enough to a person that we do know what's going on. Like if people have a difficult time talking and expressing themselves in that moment, if we know that person, we also have to be in a place of communication, of saying, let me give them their space until they're able to tell me directly what their needs are.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, which gets to everything doesn't have to be spoken in every moment and at all, or in every moment. And one of the hardest things that people have to deal with at times is the request, I can't talk about this right now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, ideally, we want to be able to trust those people to talk about them, whatever the issue is at some point, or to initiate a conversation about it at some point, or to be able to go back to them and say, can we talk about this now if there's something going on? But I just wanted to get back to that piece about making requests, because I think one of the most powerful things that we can do, and one of the most connected things that we can do with other people, is to make requests. I'm not ready to talk about this right now. Can we not talk about this right now? Or I just need a hug, or whatever it is, but to ask for what we need. Can you give me a ride to the airport? Mm-hmm. And not expect people to know what we need, and to invite them to meet our needs with specific requests.
And I think that happens in family dynamics all the time. we just assume that our mother or father, sister, brother, husband, wives, children, that they should just know.
Yeah.
You know, I think often, particularly in families, when you are coming home from work and you're tired and blah, 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 and your kids or your partner, they start in with asking you a million questions and you're thinking, don't you know I need just a minute to... No, you have to be able to say, you need to give me a minute.
Yeah.
I need a minute. But what happens is, if we haven't done the work that we need to do on ourselves, we're not comfortable asking for that minute.
Right.
So sometimes
And
we
we might
know
expect them to know.
we might expect them
Because
to
you've been around me
know.
long enough to, you should know
But-
I need
but
some
if we've
decompressing
never-
time or whatever.
If we've never shared that,
Right.
if we've never said, if we've always done everything. I'll give you a good example. And actually, this is an example that I can relate to you and actually another friend of mine. As a pastor and as a therapist, as a psychologist, I consider myself a healer. And so I'm always helping people. And I remember once I was riding with you in the car, and I said to you, Donald, do you pray for me? And your response was, well, I pray in general for you, but I see you as the prayer. And I said, well, I need prayer too. I need prayer for me. If I'm giving out, pouring out all the time, I need people praying for me specifically for that. Mm-hmm. But Don wouldn't know that if I didn't share that. Mm-hmm. And I also asked a girlfriend the same thing. I said, do you think I ever get tired and that I have my moments? And she said, absolutely not, because I always see you, you know, you're this strong person who goes with the flow and blah, 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 blah. And she
manages
said,
so much and deals with so
right.
much. And so, oh no, she's got it
right.
handled or whatever.
And my assumption is,
yeah.
exactly, and so my assumption, because I'm not communicating it, is that, but you also know what I'm doing. You know the millions of things I'm doing. So you know that that requires sustained prayer in terms of helping me through it. But if I haven't made that request known, and this is the other thing, because this gets to another sticky piece too, I think, sometimes we don't make our requests known is because people do see us in a certain light. And then we have this sort of image that we're upholding, even unconsciously.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think that that's important when we're talking about
We want to look
communicating.
good. You know, we want to look good for others sometimes.
Yeah, or even for ourselves, because we have an image for
We want to
ourselves
feel good
that we,
about how we
yes.
how we're presenting to
But it's
others.
so crucial. It's so crucial to do that. But so if I could circle back around again to this idea of everything we feel we don't have to share. Often when Susan and I are doing women's retreats, we do this exercise called the listening stone exercise. And that's where we will ask a person who's participating in the retreat, we'll give them a stone, we'll ask them a question, and we'll say, we want you to pause for 30 seconds before you respond. That's tough.
Yeah.
Because most people are already thinking about the response before you even finish. But when they do, what they find happening is then the first thing that they thought of saying is not the most critical thing that needs to be said. And they change their thinking. And it's a deeper conversation that they're having. So it's a good practice for those of you at home. And it could be frustrating to some people if they're used to this dialogue that goes really, really fast. It's just a pause. If you can't pause for 30 seconds, pause for 10 seconds, because you'll be amazed at how much can happen in that 10-second period of time. And you will begin to, one, reframe your thinking, and then you reframe your language as well. So we do want to just keep that in mind to be mindful that you don't have to say everything that you're feeling, because sometimes our feelings are also erroneous as well. I think we've covered enough in terms of saying always and never.
Yep.
That if you're guilty of doing that, try to just take that out of your language to say you always, because when you use those words, you don't notice the small changes. And I can say this because please forgive me, one of my children, and she'll know who she is, I said to her the other day, you always interrupt, Mommy, when I'm talking to you about something and you don't listen and blah, 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 blah. And she said, well, actually, Mommy, I've gotten better at not interrupting. But you see, if I'm thinking that she always does interrupt me, I will never, ever notice the small changes. And if I notice the times that she doesn't interrupt, and then I reinforce those times, guess what? She'll interrupt even less. And so we have to be careful with the language we're using. But this final one, mean what you say and say what you mean, I really want to talk about that a little bit, because we say things sometimes and we'll say, well, I didn't really mean to say that, or that's not what I meant.
Yeah, I think one of the most damaging things that we can do in relationships is say things to people looking for a desired impact or a desired effect. And a lot of times people will say things to others out, they feel hurt and they want to hurt the other person. And so they say something that they don't really mean in order to get to have, that person experience hurt as well. And it's so damaging to relationships, whatever the relationship is. And I think it's a game. It's also a childish kind of game. And I was thinking on this point too. I was remembering this couple I knew, and one of the people in the couple was always inventing wild stories about things that had happened to him, or things that he had done, or things that others had, done to him. And it was merely to get a reaction from his partner as proof that he was cared about and cared for. Well, it left his partner feeling manipulated, and the partner would experience all different kinds of emotions and a lot of dramatic stuff. A lot of the stories were pretty dramatic, in fact, pretty outlandish. And so he would go on this roller coaster ride only to find out that it was a complete fabrication. And it was just this person's way of, instead of requesting something specific so that he knew he was cared about and cared for and loved or whatever, that there was some proof in this reaction or response.
Well, I think that that's really interesting, because it really gets into behavior, and that's going to be the next thing that we talk about as well, because it's the behavior of the person inventing the stories, but also the person who's hearing the stories. We've got to be careful when we're taking care of who we are in our own selfish way, not to feed into people when they say, you don't care about me, you don't love me, because people will say that stuff. If a person is convinced that you don't care about them, there's nothing that you're going to be able to do to convince them that you do.
Because that's their thought,
that's their
and
thought.
It's stuck there. And if they don't work on that thought, and this person doesn't care, like an absolute, like you were saying, a generalization, an absolute.
Well, we see that
no
when we
matter
look
what
at
the evidence.
borderline personalities,
Yeah.
And we see people doing the dance, trying to, especially I remember years ago when I worked with teenagers more, I would see mother-daughters doing these dances with girls, in this particular case, who were borderline, who would say, but you don't love me, you don't care, and the moms would go out of their way to try to prove that.
And abdicate their responsibility and their role as a parent in order to prove to this child.
Exactly, because then that got to the mother's thoughts of, whatever her thing, oh, I'm a bad mom, I gotta show her I love, all of those things. But it also happens in adult relationships.
Exactly.
It happens in romantic relationships, it happens in coworker relationships, that you have to prove to people that, yes, I really love you.
I'm going to ask this person to do this just to see, this assignment at work, to see how they respond, or see if they do it, or see how long it takes them to do it. Yeah.
But so it gets back, so when you're saying about the thought and the behaviors, so if I'm talking to someone who says to me, you don't care about me, when I in fact know that I care about you and that I've shown you through all of these different actions that I care about you, in that moment, see, this goes to everything that we're talking about, I can choose to respond to that. So my thought could be, oh my goodness, I have to do more to show this person that I care about him or her, or the thought could be, I could take it personally in terms of saying, well, I'm a bad person because I really am not being sensitive to their needs. But if I work on my thoughts and I say, wait a minute, I've done what I could do, so that's your issue.
Right.
It is not my issue. It goes back to not taking it personally. That's your issue. I'm already changing the thought. And so then I'm going to change the way I communicate with that person.
Right.
Because if I take it personally and say, oh, wow, I have to do more, or I'm angry because really I've been showing you that I love you, so why can't you understand that? We can end up getting into this emotional dialogue at that point. But if I change the thought, I'm going to change the way I communicate with that person. And quite frankly, I'm probably going to say something to the effect of, if I haven't shown you in all of this time that I care about you and love you, there's absolutely nothing else that I can do. So you need to work on that. And it changes my inner being.
Yeah, it changes your energy. There's an energy shift within you.
And guess
Absolutely.
what? It changes the energy shift with them as well.
Yeah.
Because then they see, and that's the behavioral piece, they see that you're not going to go back and
You're
forth
not
with
gonna
them.
engage with
so
them, yeah.
you need to
Yeah.
find someone else if you need to be stroked in that way, because I'm not the one, right? That's
Yeah.
really what you're saying to them. So it
Or
gets...
do your own work, like you were saying.
Or do your own work. And let's just face it, some people aren't ready to do their own work.
Yeah.
And if they aren't ready to do their work, it still doesn't mean that you don't have power in those relationships. You do the work that you need to do. And when you do that work, they see a change in you, which hopefully changes their behavior. But you're not working on changing them. Often people get married and they say, oh, they'll change, or I'll change them. You can't change anybody. What you see when you're getting married, unless they do the work that they need to do on their own accord, you're going to see it 50 years later, right? But here, I want to just mention a couple of behavioral things for us to talk about. And one of those behavioral things is to expect that your buttons are going to be pushed, and then practice responding rather than reacting. Take responsibility for your own triggers. Know those things that really trigger you and where they are coming from. Again, work on yourself. And then when someone does something that you don't like, differentiate between the person and the behavior. And then the fourth thing is avoid assumptions and interpretations and judgments about folks. Now that is a huge one that we could spend the whole segment talking about, but we can't. So can we go back a little bit to, I think it's very interesting when we say to expect that your buttons are going to be pushed, because we're all human.
We all have our issues. We all have our triggers. We all have our buttons. We all have our soft spots. And there's no way for others to know what they are. And the closer we get to people, the more likely they are to trigger them, whether those are friends or otherwise. I think all of us could think of an incident in which we felt hurt based on something that a friend did, especially friends, but family members too, and everybody. And they had no idea that we were feeling hurt. They had no idea they did anything that upset us in any way. They were just doing their thing. And we were suffering as a result and thinking maybe they should have known. Again, getting back to something
That's
else
right.
we were saying.
Yeah.
But no one can know what your
Well,
buttons are.
but now, on the other hand, because we talked about this a little bit earlier, sometimes people do know.
Yes, and they
what
push your
buttons-
buttons on purpose, right.
And that's why you have
get
to be
your
in
reaction.
control of
Yeah.
your own behavior, right?
Yeah, and thoughts and reactions.
What about practicing responding rather than reacting? Now, that's a huge one.
Well, I differentiate between the two. I think reactions are sort of our knee-jerk, automatic responses, for lack of a better way to say it. But responding comes from more of that, taking the 10 seconds, or whatever it is, interrupting that automatic knee-jerk reaction, and being in touch with what we think and what we feel, and addressing whatever happened from that place, as
So-
opposed to the knee-jerk automatic reaction.
So if I thought of an example for me would be when we recognize what someone else's issues are, and if we don't respond, let's say that, well, I know someone who, none of us like death in and of itself, but some of us have a harder time dealing with deaf than other people do. And so I had this friend one time. I had an obituary that the friend was there in my home, and the obituary was on the table. And they said, well, something to the effect of, do you have to have that there? And I said, oh, I'll move it. But I didn't move it. Now, I know that this person has an issue with it. Really an issue with it. I said I would move it, but I didn't get around to moving it, and it was there the next day. Well, by the next day, that person was frantic and angry and upset about it. Well, if I had responded rather than reacted, because I didn't react very nicely, because I felt personally attacked in the way the person was talking to me. So I responded, and it escalated. And then I thought to myself, well, you're just as crazy as that person is, because that's not your issue. You should have just moved it. And the responding, if I had responded, could have been, I'm sorry. I should have removed it when you asked me to remove it. But instead I reacted.
Yeah.
And interestingly, that goes back to the say what you mean and mean what you say. I think that's because that's where some of that anger and hurt probably came from, not just that the obituary was there, but that it's possible your friend felt betrayed in some way by you saying, yes, I'll remove it, and then not doing so.
Sure.
And so it's kind of a question of integrity, of don't say you're going to do something if you're not. And we certainly, say that about making promises, but I think that it doesn't have to be a promise. Anything that we tell someone, yes, I'll do that.
Yes, and in my defense, it wasn't like I'm on my way out of the house, right? And I'm saying, yeah, but kind of just really, in a way, not being sensitive, right? Because if you know that person has an issue with it, it was simple enough just to grab it and put it in my bag and keep moving. Because then it would have been there when I needed it. And I wouldn't have to think about, like you said, I didn't keep my word. Because, I didn't give a time period for when I was going to remove it. But then that person is assuming, well, she's going to take care of it.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think that all of that is critical.
Well, the flip side of that, too, really quickly, is if I'm taking responsibility for my buttons and my triggers, then I also can move that. And I can flip it over, or I can say, is it okay if I put this over here? Because you know that it's an issue for me. I know it's an issue for me. I'm taking responsibility.
Absolutely.
And not asking you to take responsibility and take care of my buttons and my triggers. But I'm saying, I'm taking the responsibility.
So you see, television viewing audience, we're giving you all these different flip sides to this, right? Because the more we work on
But it's all about
ourselves,
relationship.
exactly,
Yeah.
that's what I'm
It's
saying. The
about
more we work
relationship.
on ourselves, the more we're going to have better shared relationships. And so when we're talking about owning our stuff, it creates a much more peaceful environment.
Yeah. This, I want to tell a little story that relates to several of the things we were talking about. I was working many years ago with this woman, and we had very similar professional interests. And so, to me, in my mind, there was a natural bond, or there should have been a natural bond between us. And she would pass me in the corridor and completely ignore me, not say hello, not say anything. And I began a conversation in my head, I don't like her. And one day, I just went, Don, you don't know her. How can you not like her? You don't even know her. And I checked my thoughts, where I was going and my reactions, and looked at my triggers and my buttons, and I asked myself, where is that coming from? And I realized that I felt, when she did that, I felt invisible and unimportant and unacknowledged. And I let it go. I was able to just let that go. And after weeks of having this conversation, every time I was like, I can't stand her. I don't like her.
See, I always knew you had conversations in your head. I know that, right? But Todd, what's really interesting is because I think you've covered a couple of the other
Yeah, like I
behavioral
said,
points
like-
about in terms of taking responsibility for your triggers, but also you're covering in this avoid assumptions.
Right.
Because often we have situations where I'm gonna use church for instance. In lots of churches, they have this practice of passing the peace where you get up and you shake hands with folks. Sometimes some people don't want to shake your hand. And then people get offended by that. Well, we shouldn't get offended because some folks are germaphobes, right? I don't want to shake your hand because now I got to be worried about shaking your hand. I have to sit there and be uncomfortable. And these are real issues for folks.
Yes.
So now I have to sit there and be uncomfortable because I'm forced to shake your hand or I'm forced to hug you and I really have an issue with hugging folks. Or I'm a person who's very anxious. So this is creating a lot of anxiety for me. But we make a lot of assumptions.
Right.
I've had people to do
Or
that.
they might have a cold that they might
Exactly.
not want to pass along to you.
Exactly.
They might be being concerned about you. And if we go, oh, they don't like me, they don't want to shake my hand because they don't like me, or they have issues with,
They
being
take it
social, or,
personally.
they're cold, or a cold person, or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, I mean, we have no idea what's going on.
And so we really do have to just say, well, I don't know
Yeah.
what's going on,
Yeah.
right? I want to hasten us on to our other section, which is emotions. And this is so critical because we really have to learn to keep our emotions in check. We most certainly do, because relationships are based on practical considerations, but they're also based on emotional considerations for one another too. And if I know that you are more easily angered or saddened by particular situations, it gets back to like the obituary, right? I need to be mindful of that. Because first and foremost, if I know that, don't leave it on the table to begin with. Really, it's kind of inconsiderate if you're thinking about it. In the moment, I'm not conscious of that,
Right.
and I'm not thinking about that. But in retrospect, like right here today on this show, so friend, if you're listening, it's inconsiderate. Why leave it there if you know it? But I think what happens is we're thinking, well, I don't have a problem with it. They need to get over it. But there's emotional stuff that's tied up into it. So if we could just speak for just a few minutes on being able to practice emotional intelligence, which is the ability to be aware of and express our feelings and our thoughts or our thinking, and then being present in the current relationship and not bringing up all of our stuff from old relationships. So let's talk a bit about emotional intelligence. You're smiling, Susan. Do you have some?
I think emotional intelligence is sort of a difficult concept for a lot of people, because while we can sit around and we can throw around terms like emotional intelligence and make sure that you know what you're feeling and be considerate of your friend, and there are so many people who don't. You said you weren't buying it if somebody says, I don't know, when you ask, what are you thinking? That may be true. You ask someone what they're feeling if they say they don't know, quite possibly true. I'm sure we've all worked with lots of people who have a very difficult time identifying and articulating what it is that they're experiencing emotionally. So building that emotional intelligence, I think this gets back to what you were saying about sometimes there's a need for getting help from someone else who can help you learn the skills or gain the knowledge or the tools that you haven't had.
Or even the language,
Yeah.
right? Because often if we see anger as just being one thing, when people react in an angry way, that they're feeling angry, when in fact sometimes they could be feeling sad, they could be feeling depressed, they could be frustrated, but it comes out in that way, and they only know one word to use to describe it. That's why as therapists, particularly when we work with young kids, we have up these emotional charts and they have to kind of point to what they're feeling
Yeah.
in that moment.
And I think those can be very helpful for adults too. And I would really encourage any adult who doesn't feel like they have that emotional intelligence to participate in what I'll call laboratory experiments, in which they can develop that. And I used to say that I think the answer to all of the world's problems are group therapy and dark chocolate. We won't talk about dark chocolate right now, but group therapy, because it provides a laboratory in which we can practice relationships. Individual therapy is wonderful too. Workshops are wonderful. You mentioned the women's retreats that you guys do. I am involved with the evolution training. I think it really behooves people who are interested in being more in touch and being able to communicate and being able to really connect and relate and be sensitive and make requests and all of these things that we were talking about, to seek out those opportunities and to allow themselves those opportunities to practice it. Mm-hmm. Practice makes perfect, and we have to learn somewhere, and it's okay if you don't know how to do it, and it's okay if you seek out ways to learn that.
That is true, and I'm going to end our session or our show today with talking about being present in the relationship that you are in. We've spoken today about triggers that we have, and often when we're interacting with each other, particularly in romantic relationships, we're bringing baggage from something that has happened to us 10 years before. But even when we are in coworker relationships or other relationships, because everything is a relationship, money relationships, if we were poor when we were younger, even if we have a bunch of money now, we can hold on to that, and that ghost kind of chases us throughout our lives. My husband said to me when we started dating, and I mentioned something to him about a previous boyfriend, and he just flat out said, "I'm not chasing their ghost." And so once he said that, it put that to rest, and I never brought up anything else about that again. And whatever issues I had, I learned to deal with them and work them out. Now, of course, he wouldn't say that, because I'm sure there are plenty other issues that I have, but that particular issue I did not bring to the forefront anymore. And what it did for me when he was able to articulate that is it made me think about how I was processing. So it is very important for us to be in tune with our emotions. We are not going to give you golden rules today, because we've gone through and we've given you a list of things, a list of behaviors that you can change, but they will be posted on our website at www.sacredintelligence.com. I thank you so much for joining us today. I thank our Don is really not a guest, but our colleague, Donald Bliss, for joining us again. And thanks, Susan Bainbridge, for joining us. We do hope that you will continue to watch the show. Go to my YouTube channel at Sacred Intelligence TV, and please share with others. We look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.